Hi everybody. My name is David Varian. I work with Diageo. I look after the operational excellence. I'm the operational excellence director for Diageo for supply chain. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is what I'm going to talk about in 25 minutes, which is going to be a challenge, I think. That's not a statement of fact. That's an aspiration, just so you know. This is what we're looking to do. But we have made some significant progress along this journey. And I'll touch on a number of the elements of that quite quickly, just to get through it in the 15 minutes or so. And then obviously some time for questions. So just a tiny bit of context. You might say, what's operational excellence? Diageo was set up quite functionally. And about 2 or 3 years ago went to a market-driven model where the markets had P&L, total P&L responsibility, total supply chain responsibility, and functional reporting into the markets. Which is fine, but we needed to ensure that there was some coherence of supply chain across those markets. So we set up operational excellence, basically to set strategies for supply chain, set standards, create strategic programs, help deliver those, and also then just help out in the markets when there's problems in supply chain. So that's the little group that I run. That's what I do. Okay. Diageo, won't go into the big spiel about how wonderful Diageo is and how big and small and all that kind of stuff is, but basically it is the biggest drinks company in the world, and you'll see from the stats on the back there that it's got quite a big supply chain, both in terms of what it produces, customers, suppliers, etc. About 12,000 people across the world work in supply, out of a total population of about 37,000. So that's the context. We do use the Gartner model. Some people will be aware of this, where if people have seen it before, great. If they haven't, I'll just go quickly. You know, that Gartner contend that supply chains, often quite silo-based, manufacturing, logistics, planning, never talk to each other, and certainly don't talk to the demand side of the business. So you start moving your way through where you get integrated supply chain, and then you actually move your way up to being really consumer driven, and you flex and design your supply chain to respond to those customer demands. So we're on this little journey here. I think we certainly were around here. We reckon we're up about here at the moment. That's what we tell Gartner anyway, and they seem to believe it, which is good. Right, so transforming, big word. Everybody uses these big words. Whether we've transformed a supply chain or not, who knows, but certainly we've moved it a long way. When I joined in Diageo in '98, just when it was forming, there was talk about actually contracting out all of supply chain. We're a brand-driven organization. Some of our brands, the Smirnoffs and Johnny Walkers and Baileys and Guinness and so on and so forth around the world. So it's a brand-driven organization. This whole supply thing is a real pain. It's a cost, it causes trouble, get rid of it. It's contracted out. I mean, that was a long time ago, about 2000. That was the story. To a place now where actually supply is seen as a real critical enabler for driving the growth ambitions for Diageo. At the time, we had nobody from supply actually on the Diageo exec. Now it's a key member of the exec. So it has moved quite a long way. A number of pillars that we worked on, some of them you'd recognize, like good old cost and value optimization. That's what we should be doing in supply chain, and should never get away from that into perhaps more interesting areas, which is exploring next generation science within supply chain to drive improvement. So I'll touch on a number of those in probably the next 10 minutes and give you a flavor of what we're about. Okay, talked about this demand-driven. A number of things on here. So we did have a push model, right? Push into the markets. 2 years ago, we announced to the stock exchange that we're actually moving to a sellout. In other words, be more demand-driven. We did that for 2 reasons. One, because it's a good idea and they'd like it. But 2, we had to signal to actually get to be more responsive and consumer-driven. You needed to take a lot of inventory out of the system. So when you take inventory out of the system, your actual NSV kind of goes down. But that's a short-term hit. So we've had to make a lot of changes in terms of what we do to have that market-back supply chain in terms of relationships with suppliers and distributors had to be different. And we've also had to segment our supply chain to really respond to those different requirements of different customers and different markets around the world. So quite a lot of work going on there. Customer collaboration, I'd say this is an area where we're really not that progressed, or not as progressed as where certainly I would like it to be. Although we have started collaborating quite closely with key customers, undertaking some of the things that are up there and getting some recognition. So people will probably be aware of Sam's Club, the value chain in Walmart. So we were recognized as their #1 supplier last year after a lot of work with Walmart particularly. So that would be an example of one of the customers that we work with. This is really interesting and driving a lot of value within Diageo. Not sure what companies you are in, but in the drinks industry, with all our fantastic planning organizations and everything else, actually is a very steady demand. But you wouldn't think that, because of the spikes and peaks that occur within supply and the impact that actually has across the supply chain. And a lot of that is actually self-inflicted, driven by promotions, driven by quarter end, year end, weekend targets, and really looking to say, how can we actually smoothen those peaks? And a lot of effort. It is tied up a little bit with here, of course, and that is easily said, but you really have to get in and start working then with your sales guys around the whole cost to serve, the whole drivers of trade terms, etc. So a lot of work going on there. So basically, the story of this is we're kind of supply, churn it out, make it cheap, make it fast, make it really efficiently, stuff it up to actually trying to change. So what does the customer actually want? What is the real demand? And how can we supply that in a much more efficient, effective way that will therefore drive value for the customer, better service, and therefore growth of the organization. That's that bit. Okay, functional excellence. This is kind of interesting as well. You can't advocate functional excellence, or you can't exhort functional excellence. Guys, you've got to be functionally expert. It's a real hard-driven approach to discipline, rigor, and delivery. So, for example, in our supply chain, what we've called is the last 2 years, we've said we've codified our supply chain. So we've been very clear on what our KPIs are in each part of it. We've mapped the process, plan, source, make, move, in real detail. We've put in place a performance management approach across all of our supply chain. So you go to any factory in Diageo across the world, you go to any warehouse across the world, you will see the same standard approach, the same look, the feel, the same morning meetings, weekly meetings, reports, and driving that disciplined approach across what we do. Very difficult, particularly in parts of the supply chain that may not be used to it. But funnily enough, this codification approach is now moving out of supply and into the sales organization, which is another story again, in terms of getting that discipline and rigor there. You will not get efficiency and functional excellence unless you've got that rigor, and you will not have the time for improvement unless you take away the chaos that can be taken away through putting that discipline in place. One of the things that he's not a new chief executive anymore, I guess, but he's around about 3 years, has brought in is a real performance-driven approach to Diageo now. So we've got on supply, typical balanced scorecard approach, but much more visibility. So every month now, with the president of supply globally, each market comes on a call, collectively, where we rank the markets and the supply chains in the markets according to their performance against these KPIs. Fascinating in terms of the impact that's had, in terms of changing the whole culture and dynamic of people driving to be, nobody wants to be at the bottom, you want to be at the top. So if you're at the bottom, what are you going to do about it? So there's that competitive piece, which helps. There's also, of course, an ability then to share best practice. So why is the guy in the bottom? What can he learn from the guy in the top? Is the guy in the top really that good? And all of that sort of stuff. So it's a whole big change of culture across our supply chain. And then one of the things that, just pull this out, one of the things that we are quite exposed to is commodities. And we built internally a CPRM group to look and manage our exposure to commodities. So at the moment, we manage about 60% of our commodities spend through this group. So some example of functional excellence, as we call it, but certainly functional rigor, discipline, and ability. Innovation, about 15% of our NSV is driven through new products. We define new products as being 4 years or less. It's quite a bit for a company with brands and brands that are hundreds of years old, like the ones I mentioned earlier on. But innovation is quite key. It's clearly quite key if you think of that 15%. So we've done a lot of work in terms of how we manage our innovation. There was bringing a lot of discipline in there again. We had a lot of innovation that was actually not big enough in scale, took up a lot of energy and effort, and didn't deliver. So it's really strict criteria now around how we drive new innovation. We've had to change our supply chain to deliver against this ever-growing percentage of innovation. We've put in, we have segmented a supply chain. Some of that is just through process, through managing our supply chain differently. Some of that's through investment and putting in luxury finishing lines, etc. We've actually put in quite innovative technology in some emerging markets where we've now got a thing called a cube, which is basically a spirits production and packaging plant in about 3 containers that you can knit together. We've got 6 of those around the world, and we put them into markets, and we get real fast start in markets where you need is water and electricity. You can generate electricity if you've got fuel. And that's been quite that sort of innovative thinking across creating an agile supply chain, from everything from how do we manage our current big assets, how do we segment them, how do we invest in new stuff, and how do we deliver against the ever-changing requirements of our suppliers. And then using some new technology, invested in kind of smart bottles, particularly on our more prestige brands, so you can actually through your phone get messages on marketing messages, etc., into your phone from the airfield technology that we build into the bottles. A lot of work around maturation, very key for the spirits, for the whiskey and Scotch side of the business. How do we manage our maturation process? And there's a lot of changing technology going in there to accelerate and get better flavors through the maturation process, using basic technologies and understanding of the wood through into all sorts of other areas. Introducing robotics in a number of our lines, particularly in the US. And actually, I mean, it's a bit like the discussion on analytics. A lot of people talk about things like big data, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people talk about 3D printing. I wondered about that, but actually we use it quite a bit now in our packaging plants, particularly for change parts. So that's some of the innovation stuff. Talent, rather important. Pick out a few things there. We do have a gender imbalance, particularly at senior levels in the organization. It's changing rapidly. Certainly at an exec level now, it's 50-50 on a gender balance. There are other parts of the whole diversity agenda, of course. In supply chain, it's worse. We have actively looked to develop females in supply chain. We've got a supply chain leadership program directed specifically at them, which we invested quite a lot at and put a lot of leadership support into that piece as well, which is generating fantastic results, both in terms of just basically the confidence and the promotability, and therefore the numbers of women represented in the supply chain side of the business. We looked a lot at our talent processes. I wouldn't say that they were very mature. Certainly now, basic stuff like really clear succession planning, leaving nothing to chance, being very clear on at least 2 levels of succession for each role, particularly critical roles, and really taking that much more seriously and putting actually rigor again into this area. People say all roads lead to leadership. There's been a lot of investment in Diageo and leadership training. We admit to, or publicly say, we've invested about 10 million over the last 2 or 3 years in leadership programs. It's a lot more than that, actually, where the top 400 leaders in the organization, of which about maybe a third would be supply chain guys and girls, went through a leadership program which included getting external coaches, face-to-face events, and so on and so forth. But a massive investment here in terms of that side of the business, just as part of that overall talent program. So there's a lot of, I would just say that people play a lot of lip service to talent. It's very important. To say it's important, you've actually got to put the investment behind it, is probably what I'm saying. Don't forget about this. This gives us the license to be. You've got to, in supply chain, continue to drive cost, efficiency, and value. Some examples. In the move part of our business, logistics, warehousing, spend about 650 million. 2 years ago, we didn't know how much we spent. Kind of forgotten about that part of the business, actually. Contracted it out and let it be. Really realizing that amongst like other CPG companies, it's a huge area of spend. It's also a huge area of differentiation now within CPG. So put a lot of work into how do we actually optimize that, and indeed how do we upskill our move community to operate that part of the supply chain even more effectively. We've taken 40 million out of that in 2 years, with another 40 million to go as an example, and are beginning to recruit and both from the external and also upskill our people to drive value here. And there's huge potential, I believe, in this part of the supply chain. I think the manufacturing side of it is done, as far as I'm concerned. Everybody's got OEs to the level that they want to be. The technology is more or less the same across the world. Planning have got their planning systems. This area, in terms of that connection of supply chain with the customer, is a critical part of that you can exploit now to create value. We're undertaking, we're always doing footprint reviews, but we've just launched a new footprint review to look at what is our manufacturing and logistics footprint, what's the optimum, and we believe that there's a hell of a lot more to go there. That's just underway. This is quite interesting. We've called it portfolio tramlining. So we've looked at our full portfolio of products, and we've categorized them into 7 areas, starting at value all the way through to prestige. For each of those, we've clearly defined, there's a discipline and rigor thing coming in across all of this, clearly defined if you are a product is categorized in value, or if it's in all the way up to prestige, for each of the components, there is a tramline. So if you're down at that end, for example, you have a certain quality labeling. You may not have a back label. You can only have a front label. The quality of the spirit that goes into the product, the glass, weight of the glass. And getting all of our SKUs, putting them into those categories, and being very strict about how you manage that has created massive amounts of value for us. So we found that we have high-value spirit in low-value products. We found that we've got high-quality labels on value products. And in fact, on the other end, we might not have been set up properly either. It's just an interesting way of looking at your portfolio and how to drive value out of it, which has been and proven to be hugely beneficial and driving millions out of our supply chain. And indeed also creating products that are fitter for the market that they're, and the customer that they're targeted at. Doing good is good for business, as people say. And certainly Diageo takes that quite seriously. And it is, and even in the Gartner ranking score now, corporate social responsibility is getting much higher in terms of its importance. And that's only a reflection. It's not because Gartner is saying it's important. They're reflecting what society is saying is required of companies such as Diageo and many of the ones I'm sure that you work with. So a lot of stuff around working in the communities, a lot of work around equipping women, particularly in developing markets where we operate quite a lot. A lot of Water Life program, putting a lot of money in there, which is really critical in developing markets in terms of providing water, the impact that has in terms of kids able to go to school rather than go and collect water, women's security, so they don't have to go and collect water at remote water holes, etc., etc. And a lot of work in terms of local raw materials. A lot of our products now, particularly our beer products in emerging markets, made from local raw materials. This is a fascinating thing. This is one of the better things I think we've done, which is driving a program to, it's called a Learning for Life program, which helps and bring disadvantaged kids through and train them in the hospitality industry to allow them to get roles that they wouldn't have normally able to get. Environmental impact, I won't go through it all. You can see some of the recognition we've got there. Big important part for us. Alcohol is, as our company objective says, is about celebrating life every day, everywhere. It helps you to do that, but if you abuse it, you have a different effect. So a lot of work and leadership in that whole area there. I'm getting the time up bit, or nearly time up. I hope that through that very quick rattle through, you've seen two things, or maybe three, that you can see that supply chain, critical part of businesses. You can see how you can develop programs to drive value for companies and help their growth objectives. And I hope you've seen some examples there and ideas that you might be able to take away and use in your companies.